Hi, enjoy listening. The old farmhouse on the outskirts of Willow Creek was unusually tense that evening. A grey sky pressed low over the fields, and inside, Margaret Whitaker's voice echoed through the living room as she waved her hands in agitation. "Do you understand, Annie?" she said, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. "That the man who marries my daughter must come from a respectable family. We're not talking about fairy tales here. His parents need to have a proper profession. A name people recognize in this town." Annie shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her dark hair slid forward as she lowered her gaze, the pink flush creeping up her cheeks. "Mum, I was only joking when I said I'd marry an orphan if he were kind and loved me. I didn't mean—" "Of course you were joking," Margaret snapped, cutting her off. "At least I hope so. Otherwise, what on earth would people think?" From his rocker in the corner, Peter Whitaker let out a low chuckle, though his tone was anything but amused. At 70, his frame was still imposing, his voice deep enough to command silence. "Joking or not," he muttered, pointing a crooked finger at Annie, "a girl like you needs to be careful. Boys without families, especially the ones raised by the state, they've only got one thought: find themselves a wealthy, gullible girl and live off her work for the rest of their lives." Annie bit the inside of her cheek, choosing not to argue. She had grown up under her grandfather's stern watch, and though he wasn't her father by blood, hers had died when she was just a child. Peter had taken it upon himself to shape her life. From the couch, Vera, her grandmother, let out a tired sigh. "You'd have been better off helping us on the farm, Annie, instead of studying to become a teacher. Teaching doesn't pay the bills. A teacher's salary won't put food on the table." Annie forced a smile, though her hands clenched in her lap. "Actually, Stan's parents are doing just fine," she said quickly, grasping at the lie she had rehearsed in her mind. "His mother runs a hospital department, and his father is a foreman at a plant. They can't make it here tonight. Too busy, but they'll be at the wedding." Margaret's expression softened slightly at that, her skepticism giving way to cautious approval. "A department head at a hospital, you say? That's a respectable position." She smoothed her skirt and nodded, as if already picturing the introduction. "Well then, I suppose we'll see." But Annie's heart sank. The lie sat heavy in her chest, and she prayed that when Stan arrived, he would remember every detail she had begged him to repeat. At that very moment, miles away, Stan Carter gripped the steering wheel of a borrowed car, a bouquet of roses laid across the passenger seat. His stomach twisted with dread. Annie had asked him to pretend, to wear a mask he had never wanted. And though it made him uneasy, he reminded himself of one thing. It wasn't Margaret or Peter he was marrying. It was Annie, and for her he would endure anything. Even a house full of opinions. Stan pulled into the Whitakers' gravel driveway just as the sun began to sink behind the rolling fields. The farmhouse loomed before him, weathered but proud, with its wide porch and rocking chairs that looked older than time itself. He parked the borrowed sedan, smoothed down his shirt, and tried not to think about the fact that it wasn't really his car, or that the story he was about to tell wasn't really his life. Annie rushed out to meet him, her hands trembling as she adjusted the bouquet of roses he'd brought. The eyes darted nervously toward the front windows, where she could already see the curtain shift. Her mother was watching. "Just remember what we talked about," Annie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't mention the apartment. Just say it's in town. And about you parents?" "I remember," Stan said softly, though his chest tightened with every word. "Your mom's a department head. Your dad's a plant foreman. Busy, but they'll be here for the wedding." She nodded quickly, biting her lip. "Thank you, Stan, really." Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood smoke and strong coffee. Margaret was waiting, her posture stiff, her lips pressed into a thin line. Peter sat in his rocker, his cane across his lap like a judge's gavel. Vera rested on the couch, her hands folded neatly, her expression tired but kind. "So," Margaret began the moment they entered, "you must be Stanley." "Yes, ma'am," Stan said, forcing a polite smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Margaret's eyes flicked over his suit, his shoes, the watch on his wrist, the borrowed one from a friend. "And where are your parents tonight?" she asked, her voice light but edged with steel. Stan hesitated. His throat felt dry, but Annie's pleading glance steadied him. "My mother, she's a department head at St. Luke's Hospital," he said carefully. "My father oversees production at a plant out east. Unfortunately, they're tied up with work and couldn't make the trip, but they'll be here for the wedding." Peter grunted from his chair. "Busy people, huh? Or maybe they just don't care enough to meet their son's fiancé's family." "Grandpa," Annie whispered, her cheeks burning. Stan swallowed hard. "They care," he said, his voice firm, despite the knot in his stomach. "They just have responsibilities they can't walk away from." For a moment, the room was silent, except for the ticking of the old wall clock. Then Vera leaned forward, her frail voice breaking the tension. "Well," she said with a small smile, "busy or not, it seems you've done well for yourself, Stanley. That bouquet is beautiful." Relief washed over Stan, but Margaret's sharp eyes never left him. He had passed the first test, but deep down he knew this was only the beginning. And as he sat down at their dinner table, under the weight of their questions and expectations, Stan couldn't shake the thought that one wrong word might cost him everything. Annie, their future, and the fragile love he had found after a lifetime of loneliness. Stan stood outside the emergency entrance of St. Luke's Hospital 2 days later, exhausted from another long shift. His scrubs were rumpled, his hair clung damply to his forehead, and all he wanted was sleep. But Annie's voice echoed in his mind, her pleading, the way she had begged him to just play along with her family. He leaned against the cold brick wall, his chest tight. He hated lying. For 20 years, he had survived on truth and grit. His parents gone in a car accident when he was a boy. His childhood spent shuttled between foster homes until the state placed him in a group facility. He had fought for every inch of his education, winning scholarships, working nights, never taking shortcuts. And now, for the first time in his life, he was living a double story. "Stanley?" The familiar voice made him start. Dr. Eleanor Carter, the head of the surgical department, was standing just a few feet away, her arms crossed. She was in her mid-40s, composed and sharp, with a presence that seemed to calm even the busiest ward. He had been working under her supervision for weeks, and though she rarely smiled, he respected her immensely. "You look like the world sitting on your shoulders," she said, her tone softer than usual. "What's going on?" Stan hesitated. He had never spoken about his personal life at the hospital. He had always kept his head down, determined to prove himself on skill alone. But now, with her perceptive eyes fixed on him, something cracked. "It's complicated," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. Eleanor tilted her head, waiting. Finally, the words spilled out. He told her about Annie, about the Whitakers' disapproval, about the lie that had ballooned out of control, about how Annie had invented successful parents for him, and how he had been dragged into the charade. "I know it sounds ridiculous," he finished, his voice rough. "But her family wouldn't give me a chance otherwise. And now her mother expects to meet mine." For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. The hum of hospital generators filled the silence. "Young people do foolish things when they're in love," she said at last, though there was no judgment in her voice. Instead, there was something else, something almost personal. "So, what are you going to do?" Stan gave a helpless laugh. "That's the problem. I don't know. I can't invent a mother out of thin air. And I can't tell them the truth without breaking Annie's heart." Eleanor studied him, her expression unreadable. "And if someone played that role for you?" Stan blinked. "What?" "If someone stepped in, just long enough to ease the family's doubts," she continued evenly, "would that help?" For the first time all week, Stan felt a spark of hope. "Dr. Carter, are you saying—" "I'm saying," she interrupted, "that sometimes we do strange things for the sake of others. I could meet them, briefly. I wouldn't have to say much. Just enough for them to believe." Stan's throat tightened. Gratitude and shame warred inside him. "You'd really do that? For me?" Her eyes softened, though her posture remained firm. "You're a good surgeon in the making, Stan. I can see it. But right now, you're drowning in something you shouldn't have to face alone. If pretending to be your mother for an evening helps you build a life with this girl you clearly love, then yes, I'll do it." For a moment, Stan couldn't speak. He had walked into this conversation feeling like a fraud, but Eleanor's calm resolve steadied him. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to," she said simply, turning toward the entrance. "Just keep working hard, and when the time comes, be honest with her. Lies have a way of unraveling sooner or later." Stan nodded, though in his heart he feared she was right. But for now, for Annie, for the fragile dream of a future together, he would accept the mask Eleanor offered. The July heat pressed heavy over Willow Creek, and the Whitaker farmhouse seemed to groan beneath it. Annie had returned home for the weekend, her nerves stretched thin. The dinner table was cluttered with plates of fried chicken, boiled corn, and biscuits, but no one seemed hungry. Vera Whitaker sat slouched at the head of the table, her once bright eyes dim. At 63, she had always been the gentlest presence in the household, a steady counterweight to Margaret's sharp tongue and Peter's booming authority. But lately, she had grown weaker, the spark in her voice fading. Annie watched her grandmother push her food around her plate and felt a pang of worry. "Grandma, Are you all right? She asked softly. I'm fine, sweetheart, Vera replied with a faint smile. Just a little tired, that's all. Tired? Peter scoffed from his rocker. She's tired because she sits around all day. Back in my time, women her age were still out tending chickens and hauling water. No wonder she feels weak. Dad, Margaret cut in, irritated. She's not lazy. She hasn't been well for weeks, and you know it. Pah! Peter barked, waving a dismissive hand. Doctors these days will tell you anything's wrong just to pad their pockets. She needs to move more, not less. Annie glanced at her mother, silently pleading for her to act, but Margaret only pressed her lips together, caught between worry and stubborn pride. The next morning, while Peter was outside repairing the fence, Annie found her grandmother alone in the parlour. Vera's hands were trembling as she tried to fold laundry. Grandma, let me do that, Annie said quickly, taking the sheets from her. You should rest. I don't want to rest, Vera murmured, sitting down heavily. If I rest too much, I might never get back up. Annie knelt beside her. Something's wrong. We need to take you to the hospital. But Vera's eyes flickered with a strange sadness. She reached for Annie's hand, her fingers frail and cool. Not yet, darling. There are things you don't know. Things I should have told you long ago. Annie frowned. What things? Vera opened her mouth, but at that moment, Margaret swept into the room, carrying a basket of vegetables from the garden. Annie, can you help me in the kitchen? We've got to start preparing for tomorrow's dinner. Stanley will be joining us again. The moment was gone. Vera closed her lips and leaned back in the chair, exhaustion etched into her face. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the trees, Annie's worst fear came true. Vera collapsed. The sound of her body hitting the wooden floor sent Annie and Margaret running. Peter, slow to rise from his rocker, muttered something about overreacting until he saw his wife crumpled and gasping. Call an ambulance, Annie cried, already on her knees beside her grandmother. But Peter shook his head. No need for that nonsense. She'll come around. Are you out of your mind? Annie snapped, her hands trembling as she pressed them against Vera's wrist, searching for a pulse. She needs help now. For the first time in years, Annie raised her voice against her grandfather, and Margaret, after a stunned moment, grabbed the phone and dialed. By the time the paramedics arrived, Vera was barely conscious, her breathing shallow. Annie clutched her hand as they loaded her into the ambulance, her heart racing with fear. And in that moment, one thought burned through her mind. There were secrets buried in this family, secrets Vera had wanted to reveal. And if Annie lost her grandmother now, those secrets might never come to light. The ambulance ride was a blur for Annie. She sat squeezed against the cold wall of the vehicle, her grandmother's frail hand locked in hers, the steady beeping of machines filling the silence. By the time they reached St. Luke's Hospital, Vera had drifted into unconsciousness. Annie barely noticed the sliding doors open until a tall woman in a crisp white coat appeared. Dr. Eleanor Carter. Annie had never seen her before, but there was something instantly commanding in the doctor's calm stride and focused gaze. We'll take good care of her, Eleanor said firmly, meeting Annie's eyes. You wait here. The nurses will update you. For hours, Annie sat in the waiting area, wringing her hands, her mind racing. Margaret and Peter arrived later. Margaret pale and anxious. Peter muttering about hospitals making everything dramatic. Annie wanted to scream at him, but her throat was too tight. Finally, Eleanor returned. "She's stable for now," she said, "but she needs observation and possibly surgery. We'll keep her here until we know more." Annie exhaled in relief, tears springing to her eyes. "Thank you." Eleanor gave her a small nod, then turned her attention to Vera's chart, but something made her pause, just for a moment. Annie had leaned forward, pulling a chain from under her blouse to kiss the tiny locket she wore, whispering a prayer. Eleanor's breath caught. That locket. It was small, gold, etched with a delicate design of roses. And on the inside, she knew, without even opening it, was a tiny painted icon that once belonged to her grandmother. The heirloom had vanished decades ago, the last connection to the child Eleanor had lost as a frightened young woman. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the chart down. "That necklace," she said carefully. "Where did you get it?" Annie looked up startled. "Oh, my grandmother gave it to me. Said it had been in the family for a long time." Eleanor's throat tightened. She forced a neutral smile, but her heart hammered in her chest. That wasn't possible. Unless... Later that night, unable to sleep, Eleanor sat at her desk, turning an old photograph over in her hands. She had been just a teenager in the picture, wide-eyed, standing beside her strict parents on their small farm. Behind the photo was scribbled the year she had gotten pregnant, the year her baby had been taken from her before she could even hold her. Her parents had told her the child was gone, given away quietly to avoid scandal. She had lived her whole life carrying that absence. And now she had seen the locket on a young woman named Annie Whitaker. The next day, Eleanor went to check on Vera during her rounds. The older woman lay pale but awake, her eyes following every movement. When their gazes met, something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of recognition, of shared knowledge. Eleanor sat down beside the bed. Her voice was low, careful. "That locket your granddaughter wears, it belonged to my family." Vera's lips parted, but no words came. Tears welled in her eyes. After a long silence, she whispered, "I was going to tell her, but I waited too long." Eleanor's heart pounded. "Tell her what?" But before Vera could answer, a nurse entered with medications, breaking the moment. Eleanor stood slowly, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on being composed, but nothing in her medical career had prepared her for this. The possibility that the young woman her intern was set to marry might be her own daughter. The Whitaker farmhouse buzzed with preparations. Margaret had transformed the dining room into a staging ground for the wedding. Stacks of invitation cards and swatches of ivory fabric cluttering every surface. Annie, though exhausted from nights spent at the hospital, was pulled into the flurry. Stanley's mother wants white roses for the centerpiece, Margaret announced, flipping through a glossy bridal magazine. "But I think hydrangeas will look more elegant. Annie, what do you think?" Annie smoothed a corner of the invitation card, her stomach tight. "I think Grandma should be here before we make decisions about flowers." "Don't be ridiculous," Margaret snapped. "Your grandmother wouldn't know a centerpiece from a soup pot." Besides, this marriage isn't just about you. It's about securing our family's future. Stanley comes from good stock, and you'll be well taken care of." Annie bit her tongue, her thoughts drifting back to Vera lying in the hospital bed, pale and fragile. She couldn't bring herself to tell her mother that her mind was too tangled with worry to think about bouquets or seating charts. Meanwhile, across town, Eleanor Carter studied the Whitaker name on her patient's chart late into the night. Each clue gnawed at her. The locket, Vera's unfinished words, and Annie's striking resemblance to the baby Eleanor had never known. She began asking quiet questions. Birth records, hospital logs from 22 years ago. The Whitakers were an old family in Willow Creek. Their name appeared in old ledgers and church registries. Eleanor traced details carefully, but gaps appeared everywhere. Dates altered, documents missing. One evening, she lingered by Vera's bedside after rounds. The older woman was weaker, but lucid, her eyes sharp with unspoken truths. "You knew my parents," Eleanor said quietly. "Didn't you?" Vera's lips trembled. She reached for Eleanor's hand. "Child, some secrets were meant to protect, but others have been left too long in the dark." She coughed, her voice breaking. "Annie has a right to know." Eleanor's chest tightened. "Know what?" But again, the moment was lost. Margaret bustled in, carrying a basket of Annie's dresses, chattering about alterations. Vera fell silent, her gaze sliding away. By the time Margaret left, Eleanor had made up her mind. If Vera wouldn't speak, she would find the truth herself. The following Saturday, Annie sat with Stanley at the church, as the pastor discussed vows and ceremony details. Stanley listened politely, but Annie felt his hand gripping hers too tightly, his smile a little too practiced. "Everything will be perfect," he whispered. "You'll see." But Annie's stomach churned. She thought of her grandmother's pale face, her cryptic words. She thought of the way Dr. Carter had looked at her, with something between shock and sorrow. For the first time, Annie wondered if the wedding wasn't the beginning of her life, but the tightening of a trap she couldn't yet see. And across town, Eleanor Carter sat at her desk with a copy of an old adoption record she had finally unearthed. Its edges yellowed, its ink faded, but the name still legible. "Whitaker." Her hands shook as she whispered aloud to the empty room. "Annie is my daughter." The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady hum of the monitor beside Vera's bed. Annie sat in the chair by the window, her head leaning against the glass, the weight of wedding plans pressing on her like a suffocating blanket. She hadn't told Stanley, or even her mother, that she'd been spending every spare hour here. As though clinging to her grandmother's presence could keep her from slipping away. That morning, Annie woke from a doze to find Dr. Eleanor Carter standing at the bedside, checking Vera's IV. The doctor's face was calm, but her hands lingered on the chart longer than necessary. "Is she worse?" Annie asked, her voice groggy. "No," Eleanor said softly. "She's holding on." Her eyes flickered toward Annie, full of something unreadable, and Annie felt her stomach twist. When Eleanor left, Vera stirred, her voice the hoarse whisper. "Annie, Annie was on her feet in an instant, leaning close. "I'm here, Grandma. Don't try to talk too much." But Vera's hand gripped hers with surprising strength. "No, I have to tell you now, before it's too late." Annie's heart thudded. "Tell me what?" Tears welled in Vera's faded blue eyes. "You are not Peter and Margaret's daughter. They raised you as theirs, but you are not theirs by blood." The words landed like a blow. Annie staggered back, her breath catching. "What are you saying? That's not possible. I look like Mum." "You don't," Vera interrupted, her voice breaking. "You never did. You belonged to someone else, someone they forced to give you up." Annie shook her head, tears spilling now. "Who?" Before Vera could answer, the door opened. Eleanor stood in the threshold, pale but resolute. She had clearly heard enough. For a moment, all three women stared at one another, silence so heavy it felt alive. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "Me." Annie blinked, her world tilting. "What do you mean, you?" "I am your mother." Eleanor's eyes glistened, but her voice carried a strength honed over years of keeping secrets. "I was just a teenager. My parents were strict, devout. When I became pregnant, they sent me away. They told me you were gone, that it was better that way. But I never stopped wondering. And then I saw the locket on your neck, the one my grandmother gave me before she died. I knew." Annie's knees gave out, and she collapsed into the chair, shaking. "No, no, this can't be true. Margaret, Dad, they wanted a child," Vera whispered. "They took you in. They raised you as their own. I stayed quiet all these years to protect you, Annie. But you deserve to know where you came from." Annie pressed her hands to her face, sobbing. Every memory of her childhood felt like it was unravelling. Margaret's cold demands, Peter's impatience, her grandmother's secretive tenderness. And now this stranger, this doctor, saying she was her mother. Eleanor reached for her, but Annie recoiled, overwhelmed. Don't touch me. I don't even know you." The words cut deep, but Eleanor nodded, her jaw tightening. "You don't have to believe me right away, but the truth is the truth, and I will wait for you as long as it takes." The room fell into silence again, broken only by Vera's raspy breathing. Annie sat frozen, staring at the floor, while Eleanor stood by the bed, her face shadowed by both hope and fear. For Annie, the world she thought she knew had shattered in an instant, and in its place stood a truth she wasn't ready to face. Her wedding wasn't the only life-altering event on the horizon. Annie walked through the Whitaker farmhouse as though she were moving underwater. The dining room was littered with ribbons, cake samples, and a half-finished seating chart, but none of it looked real anymore. Margaret noticed the blankness in her daughter's face as she arranged lace on the table. "For heaven's sake, Annie, you look like you're at a funeral. Cheer up, you're marrying into a respectable family. Stanley's mother already called about the rehearsal dinner." Annie's throat tightened. She wanted to blurt it out right then, that Margaret wasn't her mother, that everything was a lie. But the words stuck like glass in her chest. Instead, she forced a brittle smile. "I'm just tired, Mom." "Then stop skulking around the hospital," Margaret snapped. "That doctor fills your head with nonsense. It's not healthy." Annie's heart skipped. Margaret's eyes flicked with a sharpness that told Annie she knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to be afraid. That night, Annie sat in her bedroom, the locket in her hands. She remembered the way Eleanor had looked at her in the hospital room. Torn open, desperate, hopeful. The word mother echoed in Annie's head like a foreign language she couldn't translate. When Stanley came by to take her for a late drive, she went, if only to escape the house. They parked by the lake, the moonlight rippling across the water. Stanley reached for her hand. "Just a few more weeks and you'll be mine," he said, his voice low, a little too possessive. "Our life is going to be perfect." Annie stared at the water, her stomach twisting. "Do you ever feel like your life was chosen for you? Like you never got to decide anything?" Stanley frowned. "Where's this coming from?" She broke off, afraid to say more. He squeezed her hand harder. "Annie, don't start doubting now. You're lucky. Most girls would give anything for the future you're walking into." Lucky. The word felt hollow. Annie pulled her hand back and wrapped her arms around herself. Meanwhile, Eleanor paced the quiet of her office long after her shift had ended. She had thought the truth would bring relief, but now she realized it was only the beginning. Annie wouldn't trust her overnight. Why should she? Eleanor had been a ghost in her life for 22 years. Still, Eleanor resolved. She wouldn't disappear again. At the hospital the next morning, she found Vera awake, struggling to sit upright. The old woman's voice was a whisper, but her words were fierce. "You must fight for her," Vera said. "Margaret will tighten her grip. That wedding, it's a leash. If Annie walks down that aisle without knowing who she is, she'll be lost." Eleanor clasped Vera's frail hand. "I won't let that happen. But I can't force her to believe me." "Then show her," Vera rasped. "Show her the proof." Eleanor nodded slowly. She still had that adoption record hidden in her desk drawer. Maybe it was time Annie saw it with her own eyes. Back at the farmhouse, Annie lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling. The wedding dress hung in the corner like a pale, watching ghost. She couldn't shake the thought. Was she about to marry Stanley because it was what she wanted, or because it was what Margaret demanded? And in the silence of her room, one truth burned brighter than all the others. She wasn't who she thought she was. The church bells rang across the valley, their echoes carried on the crisp morning air. Guests filled the pews, their voices rising in chatter, as bouquets of white roses perfumed the sanctuary. Margaret stood near the front, regal in her navy dress, every hair pinned into place. She greeted the guests with a practiced smile, but her eyes darted toward the entrance again and again, sharp with a nervous vigilance. In the bridal room, Annie sat before the mirror in her white gown, hands trembling in her lap. The silk felt heavy, suffocating. The locket rested against her collarbone, its weight almost unbearable. She stared at her reflection, searching for herself and finding only confusion. The door opened softly. Eleanor stepped inside. She wore no makeup, her hair pulled back neatly, but her eyes were alive with urgency. "Annie," she said gently, "please, listen before you go out there." Annie's throat tightened. "You shouldn't be here. Margaret will—" "Margaret has had her say your whole life. Now it's time you hear mine." Eleanor pulled a folded paper from her purse and placed it on the vanity. "Your adoption record. My name is there. You don't have to take my word. This proves it." Annie stared at the document, the black ink spelling out a truth she wanted so badly to deny. Her chest ached, torn between the only family she had ever known and the woman who now claimed to be her blood. Before she could speak, Margaret stormed in, her face pale with fury. "What have you done?" she hissed at Eleanor. "You had no right to come here, no right to poison her today of all days." "Poison her?" Eleanor shot back. "You built her life on a lie. She deserves the truth." Margaret's mask cracked, her voice trembling. "I raised her. I gave her everything. What did you give her? Nothing. You abandoned her." "I was forced," Eleanor said, her eyes never leaving Annie's. "I would have fought for you, Annie, if I'd known I had the choice. I am here now, and I will never leave again, not unless you tell me to." The room pulsed with silence, broken only by Annie's ragged breathing. Margaret's control, Eleanor's desperation, Stanley's expectations, all of it pressed down on her like chains. Then the organ music began in the sanctuary. It was time. Margaret stepped closer, her voice low but sharp. "Don't you dare humiliate us, Annie. You will walk down that aisle. You will marry Stanley. That is the life we have secured for you." Eleanor shook her head, tears in her eyes. "No, Annie. Walk if it's your choice, not because anyone else demands it." Annie rose slowly, her knees weak, but her resolve hardening. She looked at the two women, the one who had raised her and the one who had given her life. For the first time, she realized the choice wasn't about them. It was about herself. She unclasped the locket, holding it tight in her palm. "I can't do this," she whispered. Margaret's face blanched. "Annie, don't you dare!" But Annie lifted her chin, her voice clear now. "I won't marry Stanley. Not today. Not like this. I don't even know who I am yet." She pushed past them both, out of the bridal room, down the corridor. Gasps rose as she appeared at the back of the church, not as a bride, but as herself, tears streaming down her face. Stanley stepped forward, confusion twisting into anger. "What's going on?" "I can't," Annie said simply. "I won't marry you." The whispers filled the sanctuary. Margaret collapsed into a pew, her perfect world crumbling. Eleanor stood at the doorway, her heart breaking, but also swelling with pride. Annie walked out of the church, into the sunlight, the crisp air rushing against her face, like freedom. For the first time in her life. She didn't know what the future would hold, and that was terrifying. But it was hers. And somewhere behind her, Eleanor followed. Not as a shadow, not as a secret, but as a mother finally stepping into the light. If you like the story, I would be very happy to have your support. Click the thumbs up. And to not miss new stories, subscribe and click on the bell. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and all the best.